plant after the initial plant up in Eureka here, which would have been something like 15 times larger than what we had at Eureka. And they're looking for a place where they can take cold water, run it through the plant, and dump it as warm water on the other side of a piece of land. And Bodega Head is one of the few headlands in all of California. It's truly a headland for a harbor, so on and so forth. So what was the situation here before PG&E got here? What you're standing on is a piece of land that's traveled over billions of years up the California coast, almost from point conception. And you get a lot of disturbance of the rocks and soil when you move edge of a plate that far. And the earthquake fault is 1,000 feet from here. Goes down right through there. AEC said you have to be 1,000 feet from an earthquake fault.
Oh.
Their first choice was the lab site, where UC now has their lab, but it was less than 1,000 feet, so they moved it down here. The earthquake of 2006 had a shift of land down at Point Reyes of 25 feet, where if you took these two plates and slid them by each other, there was evidence of a 25-foot shift. The Hopkins Marine Lab did surveys between here and Point Reyes, and they found an uplift of 95 feet out in the middle of the ocean out there.
When was that?
1906.
06, yeah. It wasn't a place you should be building a nuclear power plant. The first person that, after PG&E announced this thing, they're going to build a power plant, they didn't say it was nuclear. And was Ed Mannion, who wrote a column in the Argus Courier and had a lot of fun with it. But the publisher hated his column but didn't dare cut him out. And he had complete freedom to just really viciously and mostly humorously attack PG&E. And then Joel Hedgepath wrote some of the first letters to the editor. He was head of the Pacific Marine Lab, and not only letters to the editor, but he wrote long letters to the president of PG&E saying, look, you ought to do a biological survey on the coast before you put in a nuclear power plant so we know what damage it is doing. And of course he got nowhere with that. And then I'll try to spin the rest of this tale mainly about the people involved. And so let me paint the picture of Sonoma County at about that time. The Board of Supervisors was dominated by Nin Gadati, who was the supervisor here in this area. And Nin was an arrogant guy, and when he learned that PG&E was going to put a plant out here, he really got behind it. And he's the kind of guy that did it on his own, didn't listen to anybody. One time, somebody went up to him and said, about time, Nin, that we get a county manager. Oh, no, he says, we don't need a county manager. I managed it out of my booklet here, and he pulled out this booklet that's running the county. And somebody described him local fish market over here, just walking through and grabbing a salmon and walking out, telling nobody he was in command. So he saw to it that if they put this plant here, they'd have to put power lines into the inland, and they march them right across Doran Park. So that's one area that he didn't allow a public hearing to take place. PG&E wanted to use the tailings from their hole in the head, not use them, but get rid of them. So Gadati destroyed a plan to have a east side road along the base of the other side of the harbor, and said, no east side road, we're going to have a west side road, so PG&E will have a place to put their tailings. And so when you drove out, that was a Gadati without a public hearing. He moved the airport, which was too close to the power lines, and no public hearing. And he let the plant itself take place without a public hearing, which was fought by the anti-plant people all the way to the Supreme Court of California, and lost even at that level. So in place of getting a use permit to build a nuclear power plant with a proper hearing, he had Prather, the head of planning, change the zoning to agriculture. It was in a temporary, there's a description of it, I can't recall the name of it. So he changed it to agriculture, and of course in agriculture you don't have to have a building permit. So he's going to build a nuclear power plant without a building permit and make it legal. There are a number of people here fighting it. Of course, Rose Gaffney, who owned great chunks of this land, a real character. And she would write letter after letter to the Press Democrat, and then she'd have her daughter sign the letters, and she'd sign the letters, and pretty soon the Press Democrat said, that's enough, Rose, we have to stop that. But she had been already talking to the University of California about their marine lab idea, and was willing to make a bargain with UC. She was talking to the state park system, who had almost enough money to buy this as a state park, and had delayed themselves a couple of years because they were looking for that final increment of money. And so she was willing in both cases for those to go to those purposes. And both UC backed off from the pressure of PG&E, which really dominated county politics in those days, and state politics. So they got the UC regents to quiet their any antagonism, much to the consternation of the scientists, marine scientists that wanted this lab out here. So that was hush-hush. And the state park, heads of the state park said, no, we didn't bother PG&E, but nevertheless they didn't protest it. So it was an indication of the power of that corporation in those days. And then Gadati said, look, we're going to get a 30% increase in the assessed valuation of the county if that plant goes in. So economically, it was a very attractive thing for everybody to toe the line. And they had money in every bank, so the bankers were quiet. They hired a full-time guy to take Prather, the head of planning, out every night and have drinks with him and have their way. So, and then the other character was Hazel Mitchell, who was a waitress at the Pies restaurant. And she was a great source of information because she'd overhear these conversations with the engineers and so on, to feed that to the group that was fighting it. So in a way, they weren't getting anywhere. I say they, the public that didn't think this thing was going to work. didn't want a nuclear power plant out here. They didn't want it nuclear. They didn't want to industrialize the coast, so on and so forth. So my brother Carl, reading about his old friend Ed Mannion, who the two were historians and loved to talk to each other, picked up the This World section of the Chronicle one morning, and here Harold Gillingham had written a column about, he was writing a column every 2 weeks or so, about the environment, and he really did a wonderful job of describing a nuclear power plant here on this spectacular headland, and how sad it was that we didn't have a mechanism to keep that from happening. Those kind of decisions were up to local county supervisors. And Carl came up and talked to Gaffney and talked to Hazel and talked to Hedgepath and realized they weren't getting very far. Went back and spent a whole weekend writing a letter to the editor. I'd never underestimate the power of a letter to the editor. And, it was a very effective letter. He went down to his friend Scott Newhall. Both of them were maritime buffs. Scott was the editor of the San Francisco Chronicle, and asked Scott to put this in as a letter to the Chronicle. So Scott took all the letter space out. Nobody else got a letter that day, and put Carl's letter in. And then he left town for 3 days because he knew his publisher would be furious with this letter. And sure enough he was, but he got away with it. But that letter asked at the very end, pick up your pen and write a letter to the Public Utility Commission, who has approved this plan, and ask them to reopen those hearings. And the public in the Bay Area produced 1,500 letters to the PUC to get those hearings reopened. And that was a real breakthrough in fighting this plant, because when they reopened them. A lot of publicity around that. And that's what this project needed, was that kind of publicity. And still the PUC turned them down and said, go ahead and build it. But not without those good fallouts. And one of the other great fallout was Dave Pesseman, who was in charge of Sierra Club's Conservation Committee. And he was really turned on by these hearings, and went on to spend 3 to 4 years, if not 5, fighting this thing as its real leader. And
could you say who that was again, Bill? That one who became a leader and fought it so much? Who was that?
Dave Pesseman. He was a forestry student at UC.
Oh.
And later became a judge and head of the state forestry and so on and so forth. On the political side, when Governor Brown was asked about the plant, he said, well, it's not up to the state, it's up to the county supervisor.
That's the old Governor Brown, right?
Oh, yes. Edmund.
Pat.
Pat.
Yeah.
Right.
They have such nice, cozy names.
And in the end, Brown was turned around to be against it. So, other things happened. My role was somewhat minor, but had its effect in that had a classmate at veterinary school who worked for a publisher named Ernie Jr. when he was publishing a veterinary magazine. Ernie came to that school to buy that local paper, and he decided he wanted to buy all the local papers that surround the Press Democrat and do in the Press Democrat. And here you had the Press Democrat gushing about this nuclear power plant. And so Dave Pessinen wrote a paper, a visit to an atomic park. So I took that paper up to Ernie, and through my friend Jim Steer, was introduced to him. Ernie was a real right-wing guy. He, and a classic Western publisher, editor, described his office in Arizona or wherever it was with a hole in the window type of thing. The only guy that ever predicted that Truman would win west of the Mississippi, and that kind of guy he was. So he jumped at this paper, and he published that paper with headlines every week for 3 weeks, giving great legitimacy to our battle here locally. It was the only press other than the Cloverdale press that was against the plant. And Joyner lost 40% of his advertising, which is a real measurement of the attitude in this county. Oh boy, 30% increase in assessed valuation. Forget all the nature and the beauty and so on and so forth. So Pessin and Carl then organized I'll leave that. Let me go one other subject. Just across the street from where Lucy and I had a veterinary practice there in Kentucky, Lou Waters was retired. Lou Waters was the originator of West Coast jazz, famous for it. Had retired as trumpet for 10 years, became an amateur geologist, and he'd come over and we'd talk about Bodega Head. He was very concerned about Bodega Head and the nuclear power plant. And so I didn't talk him into this. He's a very inventive guy. And so he picked up his trumpet for the first time in 10 years, wrote a song called Blues Over Bodega, and got his old friend Turk Murphy out of San Francisco to come up, and they performed right there at the Hole in the Head, a jazz concert, and his wife, Lou Waters' wife, Pat, said, you ought to release balloons from that site out there so the whole Bay Area knows where nuclear power is taking place, and this might be a good way to advertise that. So that's exactly what they did. Put a little tag on every balloon that said, this might be a nucleotide, iodine 131 or strontium. That's landed in your backyard, and if you find one, let us know. Well, that really worked, because for 2 weeks they'd be coming down in various places in the Bay Area, and the local press learned of that, so we got lots and lots of press out of those balloons coming down. Okay, and then meantime, Pessin and my brother Carl put on a workshop in Santa Rosa at the Odd Fellows Hall, right there across from Conservation Action Office, in fact. And they got 250 or 300 people. And probably because people were getting a little more comfortable and actually being seen, or coming out and being curious about this new source of power. And Pessinen lined up experts, those that could describe the wind scale accident in England, where they had to shut down the dairy industry for 6 weeks or 8 weeks because of nuclear fallout. And you all know now, reading the paper, what's happened to Japan from that fallout. And others that talked about the use of nuclear power. As Dave said, the meeting wasn't going that well. And suddenly, this man in the back of the room, a man named Grendon, Colonel Grendon? Anyway, close enough, who was Pat Brown, Governor Brown's main nuclear power expert. And he rose up in the back of the room and started to scold the audience for even being there. You people don't know what you're hearing. You have no expertise. This system works, etc., etc. It was a pure scold. And Doris Sloan, who was in the audience, said she just felt herself fuming at having somebody like that tell her she shouldn't be at that meeting. And she became a real fighter on this thing. Ended up teaching in the geology department at UC. Anyway, that was being recorded by KPFA. And they broadcasted that in San Francisco. And then they sent a copy of it down to their LA branch and broadcast it down there and emphasized the scold. And a man way out in the middle of the desert driving his Jeep that just happened to be one of the world's renowned geologists, Pierre Saint-Amand, heard this broadcast. And it made him furious. That once removed. So when he got back in town, he called Dave Pessin and said, "What can I do to help?" And Dave said, "Well, come up and see this thing. We think there's some real earthquake ramifications about this thing." And so Pierre Saint-Amand came up here in an evening, and Doris Sloan brought him out here, and there's nobody around the construction site, no fences, nobody. And so they saw the closest ladder and climbed down in there, and Amand said, "There it is. There's a branch of San Andreas." And studied that and went back to report about that, and Pessin gave it a lot of publicity, of course. PG&E immediately hired 2 geologists to come up and refute Amand. And so there it stood at that moment in time. So in the meantime, Harold Gilliam, who wrote that original article, had gone to work for Stuart Udall, who was head of Interior in the United States government. He was to write a book about Interior or Udall or something like this. But he had an audience with Stuart Udall whenever he wanted. So he said, "Stuart, you ought to look into this nuclear power plant being built next to an earthquake fault out there and do something about it." And sure enough, Udall, who of course was in command of the U.S. Geological Service, got the best experts out of that department down in, where is it, San Mateo? Menlo Park. Now I should remember their names because they had good credentials. And they came up here and they studied this thing for a long time and reported back to Udall that it should never be a site for a nuclear power plant. So in the meantime, just a little side story. Scott Newhall was coming to work one day from his Berkeley home, crossed Bay Bridge and turned on KPFA, and there was Barbara Dane singing blues over Bodega. And Scott, that's the reason Scott and my brother got along, right there. Agreement on jazz, and when he got to the office he called Carl and he says, "Hey, you won." And of course Carl knew what he meant, because this thing had finally grown into this public consciousness, and when you get a public consciousness and music being written about it, you're a long way toward victory. So that Carl always recited that phone call from Scott Newhall. So the problem was that Seaberg out of UC was a really pro-nuclear power type of guy, and he was head of the Atomic Energy Commission.
He's a nuclear physicist.
Yeah, I'm a nuclear physicist. And so here you had an AEC being pro-nuclear power, and here you had Interior saying, you don't dare do that. And two major institutions of the United States government. So we have conjectured, and we've never had any proof, we've had small bits of proof that Lyndon Johnson finally made the decision. And part of that could well have been my sister-in-law, Jean Kortum, building a case with the political establishment, the Democratic political establishment of California, to be against nuclear power at Bodega Head. And she went to the CDC statewide and got them pass a resolution. She got the state Central Committee to pass a resolution. She got the state assembly to pass a resolution. She got Claire Engel to come out against it. And all those people put pressure on Pat Brown, so he turned around and said he's against it. And so that probably, and it would be hard to prove it is, but created a political atmosphere that Lyndon Johnson, knowing California, one of the biggest states, had this attitude out there against that plant. And so it probably tipped the scales, and he came out, probably just picked up the phone and said, stop that plant.
Was that when he was president, or before that when he was the speaker?
No, that was when he was president. Right?
Okay.
Yeah. And we got some tales that actually happened, but it's hard to pin them down. But it almost is logical, even not knowing about the tales. Somebody had to call the shots on that one. So there's no nuclear plant out here.
And the moral is start a committee.
Yeah, write a letter to the editor.
That's what we do now.
It works.
You do that too. Yes.
So, Bill, how long was the span of time between when it was initiated and when it was finally defeated?
It was about 8 years.
About 8 years. So that's a
They
long
thought about it in '57, and I think it was '64 or '65 when they said no.
Well, Johnson was in '63, end of
Yeah.
'63.
How was the final no made official? What made it? What nailed it?
Oh,
Was it announced?
we just picked up the paper and said AEC
They
tells PG&E you can't build that plant.
Okay.
Get LOST.
So it was
Yeah,
an order from the
I think it
agency.
yeah.
depends on who tells the story
Indeed.
too. I heard, what's her name? Who was the reporter that went down in the hole?
Oh, you mean
LeBaron's
John LeBaron?
John LeBaron, yeah. The way Gay tells it, that picture is the nail in the coffin, right?
Yeah. Oh, definitely.
Well, of course she's say that.
Yeah,
Her
exactly.
husband's a
That's what I
veteran.
mean. It depends when he tells the story.
And my husband thinks he had a part in it because he was a PD reporter at that time.
Oh,
Oh,
but
yeah?
we never admired your
some
husband
water?
because he stuck his neck out on the press Democrat.
Could have gotten fired.
Oh, yeah. I'll say. There are a lot of those
Yep.
in this battle.
See, I know how to take care of a baby
Well, the whole committee
for about 5 minutes.
that
Did you like
Dave
that?
Peston headed consisted of over 100 people.
Oh,
And every
yeah.
one was doing something essential.
We were trying to
Most
remember.
people didn't know what this or that was.
Come here. Can you do that?
Spell Pessinen, because Fred was trying to think of his name the other day. He's the UC guy.
Yeah.
How do you? Can you know how to spell Pessinen?
Very good. Oh
P-E-S-O-N-E-N.
my,
Okay, thanks.
girl is amazing.
Go spin it.
He went
So-
to Catholic.
So anyway,
He was a student.
Yeah, I know.
When he went to law school.
we have heard that some political scientists consider the Battle of Bodega Head, taking on a big institution and putting them down, was a resurgence of the environmental movement in California. And that could be disputed. But as far as Sonoma County goes, in my role, I think that's correct, because after that, I was appointed to the to what they call the Redwood Road Committee, where the governor and mainly Bill, what's his name? Anyway, the head of resources in California appointed 2 people out of every county from Monterey to the Oregon border for a committee to look at how do you make Highway 1 into a scenic corridor. And so we went up and down the coast looking at how we could do this, and we had some warning there that you won't be able to do that until you have something like a coastal commission that has land use power, because again, the control of the scenery around Highway 1 is what you're interested in with scenic road, and the state couldn't have control over land use. So, but it taught us a lot, and in our travels up and down the coastline, we found that our chairman had done a survey of all the park sites on the Pacific coast for the Department of Interior way back when, including way before Point Reyes was a park. It was Point Reyes here in Sonoma County, or not, yeah, it was Point Reyes. Here in Sonoma County is Bodega Head. It was Willow Creek. It was Salt Point. There's one other on a list of potential parks, either local, state, federal, or whatever. And so I was on a school board at the time there in Petaluma, and environmental training was becoming a very popular thing, and President Johnson put out a little booklet, and it's one of Great Society programs, a little thing about this big, said, for outdoor education, buy yourself a tide pool. So the chairman said that he had put aside Salt Point as a potential park, and so I called up the owner of Salt Point. Yeah, he says you can have it for $1,000 an acre, 3,000 acres. And I thought I was pretty brave at the time. I didn't have $3 million, but I started the educational establishment in the county to get behind the idea of Salt Point being a educational park. And boy, the teachers and the superintendents and so on really got behind the idea and put that idea across. And in the end, the state board, Public Works Board, stole $3 million from Southern California, park down there, and bought Salt Point. And we were pretty proud of that. Just about when the ink was dry on that, the Sea Ranch, the Castlewood Cook people said they were going to tie up 13 miles of coastline at Sea Ranch with no public access. And here we'd worked so hard for 3 years or 4 years to get Salt Point. and we organized around that, and the tale goes on and on and on. But in the end, making a fuss about access at Sea Ranch got the attention of the state legislature, and Sorority Dunlap put in a bill to have a coastal commission, and we actually, they came over and had a hearing right here in Santa Rosa about why, when we ran an initiative for coastal access in Sonoma County, the people voted against it. We couldn't figure that out either, but they had a hearing about this. They went back and started this idea of a coastal commission, which Gilliam had suggested, and for 3 years we lobbied the legislature, and every time powers that be would kill us off because they were really concerned about the idea of a commission. They were, all the power companies, energy companies, the Supervisors Association, League of Women, League of California Cities, of course the real estate people. They'd meet every week to kill us off, and they did, time after time. So in the end we ran Prop 20, the initiative, one of the last propositions where signatures were gathered by citizens instead of paid signers. And the public passed that and gave us the Coastal Commission. And then the jump to 10 years later, when the legislature started fooling around with the Coastal Commission, trying to weaken it, my thought was that we ought to have a grand march down the Sonoma coast just to show the legislature that the public still believed. And that evolved into Coast Walk, and I'm going to let...
Right here.
Yeah. Gregory Farron